Dear IPAM members, partners, and friends, on behalf of the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics, I am delighted to welcome you today to the presentation of the UNDP study called Capturing Collective Progress on Adaptation, a proposal to move forward on the UNFCCC Global Stocktake. Our IPAM chair, Carl Schulz, and UNDP's Senior Technical Advisor for Adaptation Planning and Policy, Rohini Kohli, will set the context. Before our esteemed IPAM colleague, Joel Smith, the study lead author, presents the main findings. The discussion will feature insights from Professor Ousmane Seydou from the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Ottawa and co-chair of IPAM's Water Committee, and Nicolas Zambrano, Adaptation Finance Officer at GGGI and former negotiator for the government of Ecuador. Srijita Dasgupta, our IPAM Vice Chair from CABI, will provide the closing remarks following our Q&A session. We look forward to a productive dialogue as we explore this important contribution to adaptation metrics. For those interested in joining IPAM's collaborative work, we welcome new members through a simple, no-obligation registration process on our website. You'll find the address in the chat box. Before I invite Carl, our moderator for today, to take the floor, I will urge all participants to turn off their microphones until they are invited to speak, to avoid background noise. Please, Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karim. And thanks everyone for joining us today for what I am sure is going to be a very constructive presentation where we're going to hopefully learn a few things from everyone else, and hopefully these are going to help us to do better with our metrics. Just have a few remarks here, about 3 minutes, let's see. A key challenge that this report has really tackled and is really at the core of what IPAM is about is how do we measure adaptation progress effectively? The experience of the last global stocktake did reveal certain gaps in our capacities for us to construe adaptation metrics and understand what is progress. There's clearly no widely accepted approach to assess adaptation impact. And it's not just a reporting issue. It's really essential for planning. It's essential for investment and really any sort of decision making. We need to have these metrics. So Joel and his colleagues with UNDP are going to be presenting on their approach, their understanding of the situation regarding the global stocktake, but also present a streamlined set of adaptation indicators for the 2028 stocktake. What their work has done clearly aligns with IPAM's work on the global goals for adaptation. The focus needs to go beyond the GGA to really look at integrating adaptation into the broader climate and development agenda and the goals that are aligned with that. That's why I said goals is important. Another thing that I think is important, and this report, I'm looking forward to learning more about it, does is it really focuses on a long-term approach, I think, understanding that we've had a global stocktake, there will be one in 2028, but a view I have, and I think it aligns with the work of this report, is that metrics need to evolve as climate impacts intensify and adaptation scales up and we learn more about what is good adaptation. We can't assume metrics for today's challenges will work for tomorrow's. And then, of course, also there's a problem in that we want to have the most robust scientific approaches and metrics, but there are practicalities around availability of data, availability of capacities to take on board this for practical decision making. So IPAM, just want to give you a quick heads up on a couple of things we're doing. We're planning right now a report on adaptation metrics that will really look at our understanding of how they stand, identify the gaps and the challenges, and work on approaches through this report as IPAM, through various groups working on writing this, to address approaches that can try to tackle some of these challenges. And then we're going to, near the end of that process, we're hoping to at least have a conference in September where we want to convene the experts and the policymakers and the practitioners to advance the discussions around the gaps and the challenges in the report that we're developing now, to validate it and to learn from it before we then present this at the next conference of parties. So what Joel's presentation, I think, does is it goes beyond the stocktake in terms of its importance. Adaptation needs to be tracked at all levels, from projects and national policies and for climate finance. And the discussion, I hope, and clearly the report does, help shape global reporting of real-world adaptation decisions. So, Joel, you're an active IPAM member. You're involved in these initiatives that we're working on right now. And your work with the UNDP and the work of those of your colleagues at UNDP contributes, I think, very much to refining adaptation metrics. I want to learn more. But not only will this work, I hope, inform the stocktake, but broadly speaking, strengthen adaptation assessment at all levels. So just to kick it over to you, I encourage us to think just beyond reporting and to think just beyond the global stocktake to how do we ensure meaningful, actionable metrics for adaptation? And looking ahead, how can we make adaptation measurement dynamic and relevant and impactful, not just for today, but for 2050? So I look forward to the presentation, and let's make the discussion that follows very practical and constructive, and help us to really come up with ideas for how we can move forward. So with that, I'd like to just pass the baton to our keynote speaker, Joel Smith, to present the report.
I think, excuse me, Rohini, were you going to
Yes.
say something? So sorry.
I'm sorry,
no worries.
Rohini. My apologies.
No,
I'm
no,
so
it's
keen,
absolutely fine. No, it's absolutely fine, Carl. I mean, just to, this is a very exciting subject, so I don't want to labor over too many remarks, but I think just setting a bit of the context from our side. So I think, firstly, just very happy to join alongside Carl. And to really, with the IPAM team, to really speak to an audience that we are often engaging with many different audience of adaptation practitioners, and I think this is a very, very interesting, different, strands of thought are coming together on this, and I think the webinar is one occasion to do that. We just want to really thank the IPAM, our co-organizers. And just to say that, why did, UNDP embark on producing this paper? And we're very happy to have Dr. Joel Smith as the lead author, because, we do want to make sure it can inform, it has a long-term view, as Carl said. It aims to inform the next global stocktake, to outline approaches to assessing adaptation, to really contribute to the discussion on identifying key indicators and ensuring comprehensive tracking. And I think it's also because UNDP is basically engaged at the national level with a lot of support along with other UN agencies and also many, many other actors where governments are in the lead to really develop their monitoring and evaluation learning systems for adaptation in country. And actually there are countries on varying, parts of that journey. But, so there is a kind of a bottom-up kind of process taking place in many, many countries where they are working with their, own data architecture systems. It's, there's quite a lot happening, but certainly it really also highlights the importance of making sure there is, alignment between all the different, reportings, which I think, as Carl said, is not restricted to reporting, but there are different reportings which can be really used to the benefit of adaptation assessment and progress. There are national adaptation plans, there are biannual transparency reports, there are nationally determined contributions. So there's actually a lot of political and institutional systemic processes taking place in the country. And most recently, the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience has identified the sort of need for these indicators at different levels, global indicators. They can be input, output, process. They should include marginalized groups. So there's many different aspects of this discussion happening globally. So I think for us, a lot of the decisions have some of these are recent decisions, but we really do want to make sure that we are talking to different practitioners and also different academic institutions and others to really build up these partnerships within different countries on this. But of course, this paper looks at it more from a global point of view. So we are really, sort of that's a very important complement to the work we are doing in countries. And for UNDP, the vision is really to make sure that resilience and adaptation is part of sustainable development. And I think that's not just UNDP. Adaptation is development done differently, or risk-informed development. So we really think that this is very much a part of our sustainable development goals, support, and to really make sure we are, integrating with the ongoing work that is happening. And existing work like the Human Development Index, the SDGs as we spoke. There are sector-specific work that is being done by many UN sister agencies, FAO, WHO, others. So we really need to make sure we are coordinating across this, and it's a very, very important. I think the stakes cannot be higher for measurement, because adaptation has for long been a bit fragmented in terms of measurement. So this is sort of very much part of this. The paper is situated within, or the report as we are calling it, situated with this discussion. So very much looking forward to this webinar. It's a very short one. So without further ado, maybe I can hand over to Dr. Joel Smith, who probably doesn't need an introduction from me, but very, very happy to have worked with him as the lead author on the paper. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rohini. And let me just see, am I already sharing my screen? I apologize for that. Can you see the presentation?
No, you're not, Joel.
All right, let me just get this, make sure this is working. How about now?
Yes. Yes.
All
You
right.
just need to put it on full screen now.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
There it is.
So thank you. Thank you, Carl and Rohini. And I do want to thank first UNDP, and you got to meet Rohini, who was one of my colleagues who worked on this report, along with Prakash Bista, Patricia Velasco, and there were a number of other people from UNDP who also helped in thinking through and writing and preparing the report. Also, thanks to my colleagues, Carl and Kareem at IPAM, for hosting this. So appreciate it. And let me sort of move through this. So first, in the way of background, Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, the COP21 in 2015, calls for a periodic taking stock of implementation, the so-called global stocktake. Now, Article 7 calls for a review of the adequacy of adaptation and support and progress in achieving the global goal on adaptation. Now, that was a general statement in the Paris Agreement. COP28, a little over a year ago, identified a number of climate resilient and adaptation policy cycle targets. 7 of them address specific sectors: water resources, agriculture, health, ecosystems and biodiversity, infrastructure and human settlements, poverty and cultural heritage. 4 address process and specific adaptations, including national adaptation planning, NAPS, emergency warning systems, EWS, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems that both Carl and Rohini talked about. Now, and as Carl mentioned, the last COP, COP28, sorry, that was over a year ago, was unable to assess adequacy of progress towards meeting the global goal on adaptation. Now, that was supposed to be the first stocktake, but essentially they said there was not enough information to really draw any conclusions. So we wrote this paper, to advance offer ideas about how to advance the adaptation stocktake process to yield what we hope are meaningful results. And our focus is primarily on the next stocktake, which is due in 2028, really less than 4 years from now, which is not a lot of time given the potential complications of this process. And a key challenge, what a lot of this is going to focus on, is what or which to include in that stocktake. Now, that also happens to be a key focus for the upcoming COC in Belem and as part of this Belem work process. So I want to divert for a second and talk about logic models, because it's important in terms of framing adaptation metrics. Now, we have inputs, which lead to outputs, and then outcomes. Inputs are things like policy inputs, funding, staffing, technology, training, that kind of thing, hiring, obviously. Outputs we can think of as what happens on the ground, the adaptations. Do farmers change crops? Do we build seawalls or retreat or use green infrastructure? How do we protect against flooding, drought, that kind of thing? Ultimately, though, outcomes are what matter. And outcomes essentially is the well-being of society and nature. What happens to our health, our life expectancy, our prosperity, distribution of income, what happens to ecosystems, natural systems. So it tends to be easier to measure inputs and their effects on outputs. We can look at what funding and staffing and those kind of things and say, okay, and then what happened on the ground, say in terms of farmers switching crops or the like. But ultimately, it's critical to tie adaptations to outcomes. Essentially, what difference are we making? Are we improving lifestyles or the like? If we only looked at inputs and outputs, for example, the U.S. would be #1 in healthcare because we spend more than any other country on healthcare, and yet in terms of outcome, we rank 48th in life expectancy. So it's not often a direct link. And one of the key issues is you see change in outcomes, but how do you know what caused them? Was it the adaptation? Was it something else? So here's a very brief example. This is a very interesting study from FAO done a few years ago, looking at changes in malnutrition levels. This is both in terms of percentage of people in the world and total numbers facing malnutrition. You see numbers were decreasing in the 2000s. By the decade of 2010s, it was leveling off. And then late in the decade, malnutrition went up. Now, FAO says this is largely a result of climate change. Could well be. But you have to think of that. You have to think of, could it have been policy changes, technologies, something else that might have caused? And then think the challenge is even harder if you start saying, well, what's the effect of adaptations on key outcomes such as malnutrition? So keep that in mind. That's a critical challenge in all this, is ultimately tying the effect of adaptations to outcomes. Okay, so we offered some criteria for what characteristics of indicators metrics are important. And I should say, a lot of this is also covered in a separate IPAM publication from a couple of years ago. But we suggest that adaptation metrics be meaningful, that is, that they're clearly tied to adaptation, to climate change. They're universal. In other words, they can be applied across the world, and that's critical because there are different capacities in terms of data availability and ability to gather information, measure it. That they are feasible. That ties to that too. That again, they can be implemented readily. They're not difficult to implement. And finally, that they're granular, comparable, and aggregable. What that means is that you can assess these indicators at different levels, everything from local to national to continental to global. You can make comparisons across countries, across regions, and you can ideally add them up so you can see how you're doing at different scales. All right, a key challenge is that there are many, many potential adaptation indicators. In fact, I think others may mention later, there's some 9,000 candidates for the Belem process. And here's, I found this an interesting study, very good study that FAO and UNDP did a few years ago, looking at developing a national monitoring and evaluation system for agriculture in Guatemala. And just for agriculture in Guatemala, they came up with over 100 indicators. And the concern we had in writing a report is that applying many indicators really risks overloading the stocktake process, will make it very complicated to gather all the information and make it complicated to, frankly, to compare results if that's the goal. You know, how are you going to be able to integrate hundreds or thousands of indicators? So a couple of key considerations that guided us in, I should say, suggesting adaptation indicators to be used in this process. First, there is no universal indicator for adaptation. I think that's well known. That means that there's no one thing that measures everything. But there are a lot of sector indicators, okay, and some cross-cutting ones. Many indicators are already being used to measure human and ecosystem welfare. For example, the Human Development Index, excuse me, Sustainable Development Goals, Sendai, and others. Can we make use of some of those for the stocktake? Can we build on what's already being done was a key factor in guiding us. The indicators, a comprehensive assessment of adaptation really seems unachievable because there is no universal indicator. So our thought was measure what can be measured. It may be incomplete, but some information is better than none, okay? And then finally, we thought the first stocktake in particular should demonstrate the effectiveness of adaptations reducing climate change risks. That's really critical that we sort of see how well we're doing. Essentially in outcomes, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, we did several case studies. We looked at Guinea, Moldova, Uruguay, and Vietnam to look at their monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems. Now, all 4 countries have developed MEL systems, but the progress is variable. And what this a key point suggests is that technical assistance is going to be needed to help a number of countries develop adequate MEL systems to participate in the global stocktake, but also for their own domestic purposes. All right, so we thought we should tie the stocktake to existing development frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai framework, Convention on Biological Diversity. We didn't mention there are others, such as desertification and other frameworks that may be appropriate, but that's a key thing, that again, that this is be integrated. It happens that these are all United Nations activities too, which I think is important. All right, for the 2028 stocktake, we proposed a limited set of input, output, and outcome indicators. Our thought is that a very limited set makes it easier for all parties to apply them, and the thought is better too few than too many. We'd like the stocktake to get off to a good start, because remember, there will be stocktakes every 5 years. So after 2028, we have 2033, 2038, and so on. So we're starting a process here. This is not a one and done thing. But also point out that even though this is a limited set of indicators, parties, of course, are not limited just to these indicators. They can do what they wish, but this would be a minimum common set. So for inputs, we suggest first looking at the UAE resilience framework, which happens to have a target date of 2030. We might move that up by a couple of years, but measuring have impact, vulnerability, and risk assessments been done? Our national adaptation plans in place, and this could also consider sector development plans, budget processes, and the like. Our monitoring and evaluation and learning systems in place. And another potential indicator is adaptation finance, which the UNEP GAP report has been reporting on, but obviously a key input to measure. All right, for output indicators, the graph on the left, or table on the left, shows that a number of outputs are already being measured by the Adaptation Fund, AF, the Green Climate Fund, GCF, and the Global Environment Facility, GEF. They all measure number of beneficiaries. Some measure assets improved or protected, meters of coastline protected, number of hectares improved or protected is measured by all 3, and early warning systems. So those could be measured. We could also look at just the number of adaptation projects, such that the UNEP gap report is already measuring. And in addition, and there's a little repetition here, the UA framework is calling for establishment of early warning systems by 2027, a year before the next Stocktake, as well as climate information services. So there are a number of possible things that could be measured here. Now for outcomes, there's a lot that could be measured, but we suggest a smaller set. And some of these are cross-cutting and some of these are sector specific. So the cross-cutting ones, we suggest looking at life expectancy as a general indicator of human health, not the only one. Income per capita as a general indicator of well-being, financial well-being. Again, it's not the only one. Poverty levels is an indicator of distribution of wealth. And then malnutrition is an agriculture indicator, and water supply per capita as an indicator of water supply. Now, our thought is we could start with these and again look at what's being done for these inputs, outputs, and outcomes. But then in future Stocktakes, we can expand to other sectors. And there are a lot of possible candidates, but the thought is health could be a good one because the global burden of disease actually is a very clever way of integrating many health outcomes into a combined metric to produce a comprehensive measure of health. But it does require a lot of data. Ecosystems and biodiversity may be a candidate. Now, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, is sort of developing metrics and indicators, and we hope maybe they would be far enough along, say, for the 2033 Stocktake to be integrated in that process. But there may be other sectors and candidates as well. So, in conclusion, it's critical that the next adaptation Stocktake produces clear results. That was one of the primary guiding points for our report. So having this next Stocktake, which again is due in 2028, begin with a limited set of indicators that are already being or likely to be widely used, we think will make it easier for parties to provide data. And then we think it's important in future Stocktakes to build on the Stocktake. First, to learn lessons, what worked, what didn't, make adjustments as appropriate, and then for Stocktakes beyond 2028, expand indicators to cover more sectors and outcomes. So eventually we get a broader and broader view of how we're doing on adaptation. But I should point out another important gap too is tying outputs to outcomes. That's not easy, as we pointed out, and that's going to require some research and maybe some work and experimentation. So with that, I'll stop. And thank you.
Thank you, Joel. And I have to say, Rohini, I am really glad that you provided your remarks, which I think provided that additional UNDP sort of context that was essential for why you commissioned this report. I'm going to turn the discussion now over to a couple of discussants who are going to intervene and provide their feedback and perspectives on the report, on what it means for adaptation and for measuring benefits of adaptation and how we can progress, and for the global Stocktake. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Usman Saidu, who's co-chair of the IPAM Water Committee, as Karim noted, and also is on the faculty of the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Ottawa. So over to you for your comments regarding this report and what it means for adaptation metrics and anything else you think is pertinent.
Thank you, Carl. Can you hear me? Okay. So first, I would like to thank the author for this work. It's very comprehensive. It touches many aspects which are relevant to adaptation and proposing practical solutions because we're looking for solutions. So thank you a lot. Of course, this is going to raise a lot of questions, so please stop me if I have too many questions or remarks. So the first thing that struck me is you state the obvious, which is there is no universal indicator of adaptation. We cannot develop a comprehensive set of metrics. It's not feasible. So, and you're proposing practical solution going to global indicator. But one thing you're proposing like Human Development Index, but we can challenge it as, does it qualify as a good indicator? So because you can have Human Development Index in a country go down after pouring millions of dollars. It doesn't mean the millions of dollars have not been efficient. It might be due to some other factors. So my point is that this Human Development Index is not the indicator we're looking at. The indicator we're looking at is the difference in Human Development Index with and without the adaptation action. So it's the variation we're looking at and not the indicator. So even if we have all these indicators, they are not necessarily linked to adaptation action. So we need to find a way to calculate that delta. So this comes to the linking between output and outcomes. So you still that is important linking, but what do linking really mean? As an engineer, for me, linking means finding a formula, but simply stating that this pouring million changes Human Development Index, is that the link? So how far should we go in the linking? And then my last point, so I don't want to take too much time, is we're focusing a lot on measurement, and we know there's not enough data. We have that kind of issues in physics, and the solution we found is analytics. So you can have a few data points, and then you can interpolate them. You do what we call reanalysis. And one thing what struck me is in all this process, nobody is talking about analytics. And I think analytics can help bridge the gaps. So if I invest 1 million in Togo, and then vulnerability decreases and Togo reports it, and I invest 2 million in Niger, which is close, maybe I can infer that Niger is better off even if there's no data. So analytics can be important in this process. So I'm going to stop there. So I note the use of theory of change to link output to outcome, but theory of change is only the opinion of the person who wrote it, right? It's not something which is rigorous. So I don't think it's the best approach to link output to outcomes. So I'm going to stop there. I have many, many more questions I will discuss with the authors because we work together.
Usman, thank you very much for that. I should also note that Usman is on the UAE BILAM experts group. So he's sorting out a lot of these things right now that will have implications. Before we open to a little bit of open discussion, I'd like to introduce Nicholas Zambrano, who's the Adaptation Finance Officer for the GGGI, Global Green Growth Initiative. And he's a former negotiator for the government of Ecuador. So he brings in at least two different perspectives that relate to, well, what outcomes parties want, right? And also, how do we deal with the question over how metrics inform finance? So over to you for some remarks on the report and your observations regarding its utility and ways that we can go from here.
Great. Can you hear me well? Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much first for the invitation, and thank you very much as well for put forward this document. I think it encompasses all the challenges, barriers, and articulate very well how we should tackle somehow the further steps in the process to setting indicators for the adaptation for the GGA targets. So my first remark is on on the process that we are doing now under the UNFCCC. So there is a process that successfully we, as a global community, achieve the targets. I mean that is a very very tough negotiation, since there are a lot of topic sectors, thematics, perspectives. So I think for adaptation cycle, targets speak well on how the community is interested in moving forward on this process. So now that we have the Baku work plan, and how can we deal with the thousands of indicators, one of the criteria that have been discussed about setting indicators is first to have some sort of global indicators. Maybe it goes along the proposal of this paper of having a minimum set of indicators that is common for everyone. I'm just thinking loud, like 1 or 2 indicators per theme or per adaptation cycle would be useful in order not to add burden for developing countries. But the other challenge is on having this narrative that we have discussed on the outcome. So it's important to reflect the nature of adaptation. So adaptation related indicators are fundamental for the process. We have seen a few databases of indicators under the UN and their other agencies that not necessarily are linked to the adaptation outcome. So that is one thing that is key to maintain during the discussion, and also as the final product of the negotiation. Then this period is key because experts, there are sort of a few experts involved in the process under the mandates of the chairs of the UNFCCC, and they need really to do a huge work, because they have to streamline and to decide those technical criteria indicators that could help us or help parties to at the end to choose which are the text of those indicators. But further than that, it's not only the indicators, but also the methodologies that are behind the baselines, the data availability, the data feasibility. So it's huge work. Then we have a parallel process that is supposed to happen in the coming years within the IPCC. So one of the things that are important there is sort of to replicate what the IPCC has been doing for more than 30 years with the GHG inventories, developing methodologies, proxies, a lot of information that make parties and enterprises to develop their GHG inventories that are similar to what we are trying to do here. So similar in terms of, there is a lot of uncertainty also from our data collection, data analysis, and outcomes. But they have developed a lot of proxies, a lot of assumptions. Also, the countries don't necessarily need to have all the information. They have to use some information developed in other places. So, I think that is the way forward, to have the IPCC and have a robust, updated guideline on adaptation within the IPCC. And then finally, on the application, on how can countries actually measure how they are achieving their targets, also in the light of the GST. So that is fundamental also, because the means of implementation to actually having people, the expertise, the capacities, technology in the countries are fundamental. Otherwise, there would be a lot of gaps, and the numbers and the outcomes that or outputs that we have in the process of measuring the GGA won't be enough, and maybe it's not would be enough robust. And this has to do with the GST. Of course, the GST has its own process. They have the first GST has been sort of a learning process. And this time, I think parties are developing a new or a better way to assess the GST, but with the similar steps, like the collection of information, submissions, data, IPCC reports, etc., and then the technical and political phases. So on those, looking at the GST's focus on the NDC enhancement, on those, I think the GGA could, targets and indicators could play a good line of thought for the countries to reflect on how are they progressing on adaptation. So yeah, that is something that we will need to see, and also how all the process of the GST encompasses these targets as indicators in the data collection and technical input gathering. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas. I think both of you have raised a number of interesting points. And if I could just sort of take it a little slightly different direction and ask both you, Nicholas, and Usman, a couple of questions that come from your experience. And so, Usman, you're involved in the experts group now for UAE Belém. And I just want your observations on how is the work program, contributing to developing more universally applicable indicators for measuring adaptation progress for like the global Stocktake or anything else. And here I'm not saying, well, an indicator. You may know that I am very interested in that subject and have something called the VRCs, but rather, okay, so you have some sort of sectoral indicator, and it's applied very differently across the world, depending on the context, the geography, the challenges, the hazards, etc. Do you have any views towards how the UAE Belém work program can progress towards making those challenges that are similar, for instance, for an agricultural project related to drought or whatever, but where the data, you said, and you raised the issue already, have sort of answered it with the analytics idea, but how can we make these more universal so that we can get the most actionable information that goes all the way to the top, to the global?
To be honest, it's an open question. So we are still working on deciding what's the methodology to adopt to have this global indicator. So there are different groups. The group are by sectors of the GGA. And from our discussion, each group has a widely different methodology, valid but very different methodology from other groups. So we are still discussing. In the water group, our proposition, which is close to what is done in this paper, is to start with the global indicator first and only develop a new indicator when it is needed. But as I mentioned, the global indicators sometimes, even the global indicators are not consistently collected, and they might not cover every aspect. So one of the issues, for instance, is in the GGA, vulnerability has been split into sectors, but in order to develop, each sector has still multiple facets. So we are thinking about taking a sector, splitting it into subsectors, and then developing subsectors which are meaningful to almost everybody, and then developing one indicator for each subsector. So we're trying to be as comprehensive as possible, but we know it's not possible to cover everything. We only can cover what is essential. So we're still discussing, we don't have the answer. And I'm not sure there is an answer, what we're trying.
You're trying, okay? You're
We're
trying.
trying.
And I think, you know, I think there's no reward for not trying. Of course, there are punishments if you try too, but no, I think we've got to try. So thanks for that. If I could ask Nicholas, and I'm interested in this, not having been a negotiator per se, but so Ecuador has done some really interesting work. I'm aware of that. And in many respects, you're an environmental leader. Yeah, okay. So what lessons can you share? And just speaking as a party, and you could put both your Ecuadorian hat on and your being a party negotiator hat on here. And I'll let you decide what blend you want. But so Ecuador comes to the table and it says we've done a lot of national monitoring evaluation for adaptation, you know, in particular across like water, health, ag, right? And so how would you apply the lessons from Ecuador, which are, you know, it's going to be different, but how would you forward those to this more metricsy kind of discussion where, you know, it has implications, but it's less direct. It's more a question over, well, what are the ways that we measure progress? Not, well, how much money do you get? But how would you as a negotiator or as an Ecuadorian say, this is what we want to be a part of this overall process, and this is what we've succeeded at the national level? Does that make sense? Could you, yeah, just curious.
Yes, sure. I think, well, the first lesson learned is how this planned adaptation versus the spontaneous adaptation is like landing in the country, and I think in other countries as well, because generally before we have our national adaptation plan, most of the projects and monitoring and evaluation systems were driven by projects. So now that we have a national plan, that helps to prioritize areas, to organize, to have the climate rationale or the climate risk assessments behind. So that is a big shift, big change that I think we are on the way to implement it. And that comes also, I have to measure that progress in that planning framework. And that has been the challenge for a few years from now, and to have first the resources to implement. Here is called a registry, a national Ecuadorian registry that encompasses all the components, let's call it adaptation, mitigation, means of implementation for reporting through the VTR and national communication. So this, in particularly on the adaptation component, the lessons learned has been focusing on trying to focus both on output and outcomes, as we were discussing. We have found the same challenges that the paper has raised in terms of how those are linked, whether we can attribute the outcome to those outputs, to that finance, to that funding, even to have the narrative, the text for each of the indicators have been difficult because it's a national process, because a lot of stakeholders involved. So yeah, but the Ecuador is managing through a project also, and the participation of different stakeholders to develop this system. So yeah, there will be a line to track how the policy instruments are implemented, how this policy adaptation cycle is being developed under different typologies and sectors in Ecuador, and also a system that is looking how the outcomes are actually achieved. But this last part is tricky because it took more time and more resources to understand whether we are adapting and having an actual adaptation outcome that reduce or at least maintain the climate risk under this temperature increasing worldwide. So yeah, I think that would be very useful. We have incorporated the idea of learning also, that is sort of new, let's say, within the text of the UNFCCC. But yeah, we call it, instead of MEL, we call it MRV also for adaptation. So one side of that is the learning part, because we understand the measuring part. The M is very important, and also we want to strengthen that part, like the modeling, the people, that the experts, the offer available from the private and consultancy sectors to actually perform those exercises, technical exercises. So yeah, that's been somehow the reflection.
Those are great observations. You know, two things. One is, who knows if our outcomes are going to really, but are they going to get us closer to an understanding? You know, I think that's what I'm hoping we can do through these overall international indicators that come out, is just get closer. You know, we're never going to know, right? But if we can get closer, I hope that will help. The issue over MRV was intriguing. Do we need to have V for adaptation? I think is a big question. Monitoring, yes, super important. Reporting, how can you know if you don't tell others and they can engage and then learn? But V, that's an interesting one. So let's not get into that today. But I think that we have a little bit of time for any questions from the participants. I'd like to field those. I know we also want Srijita to wrap up very shortly, but does anyone have any questions pertinent to either the paper or to these very interesting discussants' interventions?
Joel's hand was up.
Over to you.
Am I
Go
imagining?
ahead. I'll defer to questions.
Well, Joel, while we're waiting, why don't you respond to these?
Well, just to say, first, I'm pleased to see a lot of discussion was on how we ultimately measure what good we're doing, right, on the outcomes. And I think it is very easy to get caught up in measuring the inputs and the outputs, which are necessary but not sufficient. Okay, so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think good points are raised, questions about baselines. You know, you see an outcome indicator going up or down. What does that mean? It might be going down, but your program might actually have, you know, still made things better off than it would be otherwise. These are all critical things. I think one observation I have, and it does concern me, I think, is because of the, you know, just the nature of the UNFCCC negotiating process with so many parties and all that. I think it would be a challenge, I suspect, to limit this next stocktake to a smaller set of indicators, because I think there is a real tendency to, you know, borrow a phrase the Secretary General of the UN likes to mention, the everything everywhere all at once. You know, we have to measure everything and do it all. But again, to reiterate, worry that just being overwhelming and risking, particularly leaving the countries that need adaptation the most, the ones with least capacity, leaving them the furthest behind, and giving us, the whole point is to give us useful information so we can see where problems are, how well they're being addressed. So I just reiterate that this may require help from IPCC, you know, from others in terms of how you link outputs to outcomes, all those kind of things. So I'd give that some thought. So thanks.
Thank you. I think those are good questions. Dr. Balgas, we're getting close to the hour, and I want to give Srijita her time, but do you have a brief question or comment? You just give.
Very brief question. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Familiar faces. Yeah, I have always thought about why not having like a global goal for adaptation similar to the mitigation one, like fixing a specific date by 2025. We should have like zero vulnerability, or we have it like a finance target. In the bank, we aim to have like 25 billion by 2025. 50% should be allocated to adaptation. We also have like 100% of the bank investment should be informed, like climate proof by certain date, So if we can have it similar, then we will have a similar target. We can have an indicator that will monitor and evaluate the ultimate target of adaptation. Just a thought. Thank you.
Jill, do you have any quick thoughts on that?
I think setting dates and those kind of things is perfectly reasonable. I mean, just as I think, we've already seen in some of the UAE frameworks and other things, I think, and again, with very, specific, concrete targets, makes a lot of sense. And they tell you, how are you doing? Did you meet them by that date or not? That's what you want.
You're muted.
Muted, Carl.
Sadly, we're almost done, but fortunately, we have Srijita to finish up this with a few remarks. So just from my part, thanks, everyone. I think this was a very constructive meeting. Over to you, Srijita.
Yeah, no, thanks, everyone. No, I think what I really want to do is send through a vote of thanks on behalf of IPAM as well to Joel and UNDP. So that's Rohini, Prakash, and others, Patricia, involved in developing the paper on capturing collective progress on adaptation. I mean, as was alluded, or rather very explicitly mentioned in the beginning, that stakes are high, but I also think momentum is higher this year in the lead up to Belém. So it's a very timely piece of work to advance the work, bringing together, and what's really bring together what's existing. And I think that's a really useful bit of it, that we're not reinventing the wheel, but building on frameworks that are already existing, and that's value addition in my mind. So Usman and Nicholas, they bring in a very relevant dimension of adaptation metrics, which are non-ending or unending challenges, list of challenges at the national level, at the technical scale, and I'm sure at the local levels when discussion goes down to that. But challenges are many, but there are also opportunities, which we have heard from Nicholas from his work in Ecuador, and as well what Usman said, that there is opportunity to bring in good data and analytics in the process to streamline. How we do that, I'll leave it to him and the 78 experts to decide. But I mean, overall, it has been a great discussion, and I have learned a lot. Just to also reiterate that IPAM is a big group of members who are working on this adaptation metrics, and this is a very positive outcome of a good collaboration with UNDP, and hopefully we can continue this. And as Carl mentioned, we are working together on a paper and a conference towards the end of the year. So hopefully that will be another meaningful collaboration going forward. Thank you, everyone. And I hope everybody has a very good rest of the day.
Maybe a last word saying that everybody can really join IPAM. It's not a constraint. I mean, if you join IPAM, you will have access to a lot of information and the possibility, not the obligation, to participate in our works. I insist possibility, not obligation. Thank you.